Welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your continued patience. We are going to do a slight change of program, but I'm sure the program and the speakers that we have and the calibre of the speakers that we have is going to make the day worthwhile. So I'd like to call on our esteemed kamatua to give us a bit of a welcome.
Kia ora tātou. Greetings to you all. In keeping with the traditions of the Tairāwhiti, I will start with a prayer. No reira ke inui tātou. Let us pray. He horona re kororea ki te atua, he maungārunga ki te whenua, he whakārapai ki nā tangata katoa. Ei hua o nā manu, nei au mātou o pōnanga inui sneke a koe. Ke haramai koe ki waini a mātou I te reira. Uera ti o mātou ngākau, o māramatanga. Ārakingi a mātou roti o mātou mahi katoa I te reira. Māhau ki te whena mai nā kuhau te tikata pono, te māramatanga me te aroha. Mā mātou ki whakarori e tu ingoa tapu I nā wā katoa. Kuhi kreitio ki tō mātou kai whakaora. Amen. No reira, e mihi kau ana ki a koutou katoa. Greetings to you all. Ki o tātou manuhiri, ko haramai I wainui a tātou I tēnei rā, anui rā te mihi ki a koutou. To our visitors and to those running this program, greetings. Welcome to the Tairāwhiti. Kei te whiti mai te rā, he whakamahani a koutou. The sun is shining to warm you fellas up for today. No reira, hea ke kore, te mea nui, a nei rā tātou, e korero nei mo nā huatanga, e pāna ki te hunga haua. I understand we're here, gathering here today, to look at the issues surrounding abuse to our disability. Our people with disabilities. And it's wonderful that you, the people who do all the research and do the work on the ground, are here amongst us to bring your knowledge and what you've found to show us here today. I suppose the dream is at the end of this day and the end of this program, we'll all have some more tools that we can put in our kete to help us with the work ahead of us. I'm not so sure what's happened to our country lately. It seems to become very uncaring for whatever reason. But it's time we need to turn all that around, because these people and others need all the help they can get. And the wonderful thing about the Tairāwhiti, I can say, there's thousands of volunteers here, and there's always somebody to help somebody. Nō reira, kāre toangia tēnei mea te koro, te mea nui ke, ko te kaupapa, ko te wawata, the hopes and dreams of what can come out of this today. Nō reira, I tēnei wā, ka hoki nā mahara ki te hunga ko wehe atu I te pō. One of the things we never forget is those that have left us and gone to that other world. And so we pay tribute to them and remember them. This day, we've lost a very good friend that I grew up with, played rugby with, and grew up in a lovely little place called Te Karaka. So we bid them farewell, but we come back to us who are living in this world and still doing the work that we need to do. Nō reira, kāre tōngia tēnei mea te koro, mea nui, a nei rā, ko tā mai koutou, ka huki tonu au ki o ko koro. Te mutunga o tēnei rā, ko mārama mai nā hotanga, kei mui a tātou ki te awhi tēnei hunga. I want to finish by saying hopefully, and I'm sure it will happen, that by the end of this day, that with your knowledge and what you know and what you can bring to us here today, that we'll find a pathway that we can make life much better for these people who need us. No reira, huri noa tō tātou whare. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Everland. There's another tradition. Hara mai. What's your song? Hara mai, Timothy. Koe nei nā manu ti oro. These are the songbirds. Timata. Te aura, te whakapono, me te agambari e, tātou e. It's not a very long song, but it has a big meaning. It's full of love, it's full of thoughts, and it's full of caring. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, thank you for that. I'd like to ask Dr. Michael Roguski to come up and be our first presenter. A little bit of background is available on our website, and Dr. Roguski is the author of the report that was commissioned that really, I guess, set the scene and set all this up for this conference today, and of course the outcomes that we're going to be talking about later on in the day. So after lunch, there are a few of us that will be meeting as working groups, and then we're going to find a way forward for a pilot program. And if you want to be a part of that, please make yourself known to Leslyn or some of the guys with the orange shirts on. So, Michael.
Kia ora koutou, ko Mikaeri Roguski ahau, ko Tiati awa rawa tūwharito ngā iwi. We've come full circle. There was a small group of people that came to me in 2011 and said, we've got an issue and we really want to investigate it. And so that was Adrian Baird, Margaret Price and Leslyn Jackson. Then a number of very strong people in this community rallied around and formed a collective. We wrote an application to lotteries, which we were thankfully successful, and we began this research. Coming full circle is very symbolic, though, because I don't know of any other community in New Zealand who'd be so willing to say, come in and look at us warts and all. We have an issue. We really want you to expose it. And I think that speaks very strongly for Tairāwhiti. So it also speaks very strongly to have someone who's an outsider to come in. So thank you, and thank you for the strength, but also support. Now, do I click?
No, sorry. I will wait.
So let's just launch into it. So if we look at the research objectives, the aim of the research was to understand the nature of abuse experienced by disabled people who require high levels of support, identify factors that maintain the continuation of abuse, and develop an evidence base from what we could look at interventions and develop a policy response. So I call it participatory research. Participatory research is not some academic that comes in and studies a community, but this is very much bottom up. The strength of participatory research is that the community owns the research, and we reinforce that because we had a hui at the end where the findings, participant stories were reported back after the analysis, and I asked representatives to test it. And so there was a degree of ownership at a community level. Participatory research is also really important in the sense that there's a type of research that you write and just sits on a shelf and gathers dust. And I think even today is evidence of the fact that this research is in no way going to be something that that has sat there doing nothing. So if we just looked at who participated, in total we had 44 people, 10 disabled individuals, but also family members, residential managers, there were 4, and 11 community stakeholders. At a national level, though, so what I tried to do was take the stories that were coming from here and test them at a national level. That included New Zealand Police, a series of disability advocates, one legal representative, and a social work representative. So I just wanted to go over briefly the types of abuse that were identified, and then we'll get on to looking at some of the structures or mechanisms that maintain abuse, allow the status quo to be maintained. First is financial abuse. This includes theft, denial of funds, taking control of finances, not paying for required prescriptions, extortion, care workers showing up late, but receiving full pay. It's important to appreciate that this just isn't money. There were many cases of someone's debit card and PIN number being used in the wrong way, but it was also taking someone's clothes, their food. I have had lots of money stolen by care workers. Personal items have gone missing, food and clothes. I think they think they can take food from me because I find it hard to get down to the kitchen. They say, if you do not give us money, we'll throw you out of your chair. The next is physical abuse. This included being kicked, stabbed, slapped, punched, and being thrown out of wheelchairs and mobility scooters. Can we just go back? So this came from someone who was extremely physically, he was reliant on care workers to a high extent. Kids do horrible things to me. I'm on my mobility scooter and they get smart or they throw things. The next is emotional and psychological abuse. This includes a broad range of strategies that demean and intimidate the individual through non-physical means. These include verbal disparagement and inaction, including neglect. Notably, emotional and psychological abuse manifested in 2 forms. The first is the extreme and overtly intimidating behaviour, and the second is in a guise of social acceptability. So just going back to the quotes, I had one care worker who would whisper in my ear, "Do you know how lucky you are to have me?" It was a threat. So that person, if you can imagine, they were in a wheelchair and, again, highly reliant, and it was this constant whispering that you need me. Without me, you're going to go hungry. Without me, you're going to be sitting in your own waste. One of the main problems with your caregivers is that they take their problems out on you. If they have problems, they come here and take it out on me. It makes me feel scared and powerless. Next was sexual abuse. Those who had been sexually abused by family members related a sense of extreme violation and heightened sense of vulnerability. This generally occurred in their childhood. The vulnerability, though, was linked very much to physical disabilities, and I had many stories of people just talking about not being able to run, not being able to escape. And so that's why you see the quote, this one woman felt like she was a sitting duck. What was important about these stories, though, is that participants cited sexual abuse as their first lesson in being silenced and learning not to complain for fear of retribution and learning that they can't escape. The next type of sexual abuse was discussed in terms of residential facilities. The staff were described as facilitating abuse in a number of situations by having an open door policy on the girls. So in this context, what they were talking about were other residents with low impulse control, just not protecting the other residents and just allowing them to go into the rooms or not. Next, we have locked-in abuse. This is relatively new to the literature. So, locked-in abuse encompasses situations in which a disabled individual's mobility and or ability to communicate are removed. As a consequence, the individual is so restricted that they are isolated and completely reliant on another party. Examples of this were an individual in a wheelchair, and the family refused to put in a ramp. So whenever they needed to leave the home, they had to rely on other people. There was someone else who relied on a computer to communicate. And when someone was angry with that individual, or the care worker in this case, the computer was removed. So the individual had no ability to communicate their needs. And the end result of both forms of locked-in abuse is extreme isolation and vulnerability. The next is dehumanising processes and treatment, where the individual is so objectified that their personal choice and voice are invalidated. I guess technically this isn't abuse in terms of the literature, but this is the most pervasive. This is when we see the individual's personal rights are removed, the individual, disabled individual is socially excluded, and they're made to be made invisible. So one account was a woman was in a wheelchair, she had a family member with her, and she went to pay. The person behind the cashier just ignored the individual in the wheelchair and insisted on dealing with the able-bodied individual. So that was that sense of invisibility and being excluded. Exclusion was also talked about in terms of architecture, not being able to park at the local supermarket, and just this constant reminder that you are second class. Dehumanising also came up in that you don't have a right to sex. You're disabled. You don't have a right to have children. You're disabled. And this account speaks to that. So there was an account of Dora and Eric, who were residents in a residential facility. Eric was 50 years old and Dora 40. The couple had only recently started a relationship and were looking forward to having dinner together on Friday night. But they said that their date might have to be cancelled, as the manager of residential service, had said that they needed to have a staff member present to chaperone them. Eric and Dora said that this was because the manager did not want them to have sex. So I asked them, how often do you think the manager has sex a week? They said that was none of their business. And I said, exactly. So what makes it the manager's business if you have sex? The next example is about treatment in hospital, and it speaks to the fact that my participants talked yet again about having a second-class status. In my view, I was raped by the hospital system. I started menstruating when I was 9 and happened to be in hospital because my father needed some respite from looking after me. So what happened was that I was almost hogtied on the floor of the hospital. I was screaming. They held me down as a nurse inserted a full-length tampon. I was totally humiliated. They thought it was the best approach, but I felt completely exposed and disempowered, absolutely vulnerable. In hindsight, I have no idea why they didn't give me a sanitary pad. Why in God's name force a tampon into me? Next, we're going to look at some structures that maintain the status quo. I normally have a really pretty flowchart, but I can't remember why I deleted it. But today you don't have a flowchart, so we'll just break it down in a linear fashion. First of all, are pervasive negative societal views towards disabled people. And this quote summarises it very well. If you are bent or broken, you're not a real person. So these negative views create a permissive society. Where there is permission to treat people as second class, it also precludes clarity around the identification and intervention in cases of abuse. Inherently, the same standards that protect able-bodied people are not ingrained in our communities, and abuse continues. Many people do not know when or how to respond. Every participant had stories of being treated as second-class citizens, of being stared at, of being ignored, and in some situations of outwardly being verbally or physically abused by strangers. The next structure is silencing. A lot of people's stories was all about silencing. And the quote here speaks to a residential manager I interviewed who, when he first took over his role, he said that there was just so much psychological and emotional abuse that he didn't know what to do. And one of the things that he would hear all the time was a type of negation, a type of silencing. And that's when he says, what you hear is, oh, she's just a fucking liar. She's not able-bodied. She's not complete. We can't treat her story as valid. So silencing involves disabled people being pressured not to report incidents of abuse or complaints of abuse being ignored by a third party. To say, my participants also said that through a process of silencing, of learning to be silenced incrementally, they talked about this process, and that what contributed to the process was negative experiences resulting from past complaints, not being believed in the past, a fear of retribution. So they may have made a complaint and they'd just been punished. So the one punishment was they made a complaint to a residential manager. The care worker was asked about it. There wasn't sufficient evidence, and the retribution was being kept on the toilet for 12 hours. A concern that removal of a care worker or a family member would result in solitude and a lack of care. But also silencing occurred through collusion. So staff members and family members not want it. It's almost a sense of protecting the family or protecting the workplace. So colluding together to rather than pinpointing it, rather than highlighting the issue. The next structure is insufficient monitoring. All my participants said that they feel that residential and home-based provision of care services are insufficiently monitored. So what we often see in residential facilities or care services is a survey, which requires someone to have eyesight. Like the ability to actually read it. It also assumes confidentiality, anonymity, which isn't there because they have to fill out the survey and give it to someone to post. So that what they're saying is that this is it's below insufficient. This is not an adequate way to monitor someone. It was also said that insufficient monitoring was the one thing that kept the status quo the most. So the things that led to cases of care worker abuse was the lack of quality of service provided, individual, client or family satisfaction. So families generally aren't questioned about how satisfied they are or happy or any concerns to do with the care that their family member might be receiving. And this also highlights a real isolation of people who live within a family unit, that there are very few protections and monitoring mechanisms for people who do live within the home. People also weren't aware of government agencies any government agency that adequately monitors care. The next mechanism is poor management practice. There were some pockets of excellence to do with management, but there was a lot of weakness. So in terms of the weaknesses, there was people talked about low levels of professionalism, a lack of appropriately trained staff, extreme nepotistic hiring practices. So what that meant was, if I'm a manager and I hire my daughter and my daughter is accused of being a perpetrator What do I do? Do I fire my daughter or do I deal with it? There was also very low levels of training, and this was highlighted as a real weakness. To be fair, when I did interview residential service managers, their budgets were so constrained that there was an ability within their finances to do adequate training, but it is something that needs to be addressed. Next, inadequate reporting mechanisms. So as I said, there's a real reluctance to report because of past negative experiences with service organisations, management and the police. From a service organisation point of view, people had learnt that managers don't respond. And I just need to stress that participants showed me emails of their complaints and there were no replies from management. You know, like this, these are very real accounts. I did my best to follow up complaints and those sort of things, but there was just no response. Or when there was a response, people were punished. In terms of contacting the police, people didn't feel that this was an option. Complaints had previously been negated, and there was a belief that you weren't going to be seen as a reliable witness. This was especially true for people with a psychiatric illness. I had one person who had a diagnosis from 20 years ago, absolutely fine on their medication, an integral member of the society, but when a complaint was laid, it was thought that they wouldn't be, their case would not hold up in course because of their diagnosis. Police were given evidentiary requirements, but they have told people that there's insufficient evidence to prosecute. There were many of my people felt that there was a real impatience to deal with them and their complaints, and just not sitting down and listening and dealing with it, but standing over and wanting to deal with it now, not realising that some populations just need a little bit more time, a little bit more care. There was an assumption too that the care workers who could have been the perpetrator is there who could assist with communication. So if my care worker is my abuser, why would I go to the police? Because that's the only person who can speak on my behalf. And also, the police at the time were described as not realising that a complaint of abuse puts the individual at immediate risk. So the police may leave, but the abuse could occur within the immediate future. Now I'm going to talk about legislation, and because the judge is here, I do this with fear and intrepidation. Be gentle. So, in terms of legislation was perceived as providing protection for able-bodied individuals, and in many situations excluded the unique experiences of the disabled. So we have the DV Act. I mean, the DV Act is quite an amazing piece of legislation, but in terms of the DV Act, it is about domestic relationships. So if your perpetrator is your care worker, there is the grey area within this, because that is, what do you do, you know? Next, we have the Crimes Act. The Crimes Act criminalises a series of crimes against the person. So these do include theft, common assault, sexual violation, sexual exploitation, failure to provide a standard of care, neglect, and the failure to protect from injury, the ill treatment of neglect or of a vulnerable adult. So it is there. But while the DV Act arguably provides the most encompassing definition of abuse, the Act only applies to abuse experienced in domestic relationships. And, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. And so inherently, the burden of proof required for the Crimes Act is too high. So we're dealing with an issue to do with beyond reasonable doubt rather than a balance of probabilities. So people were feeling it's like the police wanted a higher degree of evidence to prosecute under the Crimes Act, because a lot of this abuse was psychological, emotional, it was very, very hard to isolate it. And I really would love Peter to talk more about that, because I think there are some weaknesses within our legislation that there could be strengthened. Anyway, community-derived solutions. What was cool about this research is that every recommendation came from your community. So at the first is disabled people need to be at the forefront of solutions. Nothing about us without us. There's a need for community education and awareness raising. So a lot of this goes back to really challenging the embedded second-class status of disabled people. Specialised training for police. The need to implement an independent client satisfaction monitoring system. Independent probably means third party, in a way that is conducive to individuals and doesn't require paper or a third part, the person like a care worker completing it for you. The requirement of staff and management to demonstrate the attainment of relevant educational standards, criminal history and pre-employer checks, knowledge of disabled people's experience and particular vulnerabilities. When I did talk to care workers, there was just no appreciation or knowledge, I should say, no knowledge of victimology, of abuse, and there was no understanding of whistleblowing, about to be able to go forward and just name it and shame it. Establish a vulnerable adult statutory body with powers to protect the vulnerable adult during and after investigation. So this was based on a CYF model. While there are weaknesses with CYF, there are some real strengths. While an investigation of abuse is underway, the vulnerable child is removed and in protection. The suggestion for an independent statutory body came about because there is no provision for that currently. Well, if there is a provision, there is not being acted on in terms of someone who's disabled who's made a complaint about abuse. The complaint happens and they remain in the situation. And the final is review legislative inadequacies. Okay, thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thank you for that, Dr. Rogalski. We will have a panel at the end of all of the speakers, and at that time you can ask questions, so feel free to make a note of any questions or comments that you have, and then you can address that to the panel. We currently have about 78 people watching online, and which is really great to see. So we have had a few technical problems, but they've now been overcome. We are recording this as well, and that recording will be available. So even if you want to catch up on the speakers again, you can. The next speaker is Rachel Noble, and if we could have Rachel. Is Rachel in the room? Great, fantastic. Sorry.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's very nice to be here in Gisborne and to talk about this very important issue with you today. I will voice for the rest of the presentation so the interpreter can hear me and she will sign for me.
Okay. Good. You can see Disabled Persons Assembly, the organisation I'm from, and our branding is for a whole new attitude, which means that we are wanting to promote a new way of thinking about disabled people, a new way of building relationships and engagement so that we can address all the outstanding issues that do affect disabled people. The focus for my presentation today is to look at the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and see how that can be used as a tool. I think we've just heard a really good presentation covering the issues and covering the problems. So this presentation is to frame how it can be, how it should be, and hopefully will help us in our conversations later. But before we go on too further, I want to give thanks to certain people. One of the students, when I was a teacher in deaf education, I had students who would come to school daily and it was clear that they were abused, the pain that they must have been going through on a daily basis. However, those children had no language in which to tell their story, but also they had no recognition of the fact that what was happening to them was actually wrong. I also want to thank the disabled people, past and present, who have been working on this topic for many years, but also while raising these issues, also experiencing discrediting and abuse that happens in other levels. So really what I'm saying is abuse happens right across the community, particularly for disabled people. And I also want to thank Tudor and Liz Lynn and Tawhiti Voices for holding this really important event. So DPA, we promote the well-being of all disabled people in New Zealand. We're active in the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And last 2 years ago, we worked with many of our community members, disabled people, service providers, government agencies, and we agreed that the way to move forward to address any issues is to collaborate, to focus on attitude where disabled people are seen as a whole person, and compliance with the convention, but also that abuse and safety was one of the four critical topics that needed to be worked on. And we call ourselves the Disabled Persons Organisation, which means we're governed by disabled people. Our members are disabled people plus their allies, and our focus really is on disabled people. So what I want to do now is look at the foundation, and probably you'll be surprised to see the next slide, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the foundation of this conversation. It came about in 1948. And when we move on to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it doesn't say that there are new rights for disabled people. It's actually using the same rights that were written up in 1948, but articulating them for our community. And obviously, it is the purpose is to promote, protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all people, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. So the examples we've just heard have shown that that's clearly not happening. We're also to remind people that people with disabilities include those who have physical disabilities, mobility, mental disabilities or psychosocial disabilities, intellectual learning disabilities, sensory disabilities. And it's not us that have something wrong with us, actually. It's how we interact with society or how society interacts with us. That's where the problem is, because we're actually okay. So the convention is giving us the paradigm shift, and Michael used the language of object. We've been objectified, and the convention is moving us from being an object to being a subject, as a person with rights. And we can claim those rights. We should be able to use those rights in the same way that everyone else in the community does. And we should be able to make our own decisions. We should have free and informed information. And we should be active members of society, not put away in the background. And again, I want to reinforce that disability is an evolving concept, and the disability is the interaction between us as a person with something unique about us and the attitudinal and environmental barriers that get in the way, that stop us from being able to fully participate. So it's really reinforcing that we're actually as equal as everyone else. We're all born equal. It's what happens after that creates some issues. So the key messages from the convention is that it gives us the opportunity to create a paradigm shift. Disabled persons organisations and disabled people, we have a vital role in making this shift happen. Nothing about us without us. When you see effective and active involvement of people with disabilities, then you're more likely to get successful outcomes. And we've seen that in many examples where projects have come about, designed with all the good intention, expecting to have the great outcome. But if the disability lens is not in there, it actually goes off track somewhere along the way, and we don't want that to happen. So, still with the convention, there are 4 particular articles that are particularly relevant. One is the liberty and security of the person, that we should not be deprived of anything just because we have a disability. Article 15, freedom from torture or cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment and punishment. And this includes the ability to give full consent to any medical or scientific treatment that we might receive or access. And Article 16, freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse. The need for governments to take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, educational measures to protect disabled people both within and outside the home. To ensure disabled people have the right assistance and support, including information, education, and for the disabled person to be able to avoid and recognise and report abuse when it does happen. Programs and facilities need to be monitored independently, and there also needs to be measures in place to promote recovery, rehabilitation and social reintegration that fosters health, welfare, self-respect, dignity and the autonomy of the person. We must remember the particular focus we need to have on women and children. So who are we? Who are we talking about? We're talking about 1.1 million New Zealanders. That's a lot, 25% of the New Zealand population. We are present in every community, urban environment, rural environment, all ethnic groups, all ages, all impairment type, all degrees of impairment type. And yet 1 in 2 experience violence through their lives. There are millions and millions of stories of abuse. I don't think I could ever actually meet a person with a disability who doesn't have an abuse story to tell in some form. We're also forgotten in the wider discussion about abuse in the society. And we know from some work that's happened in the Southeast Asia area that when the focus does bring the disability conversation with the abuse conversation together, and you have that focus on disabled people, that's when you can really start to address abuse right across society. But if they're forgotten and not part of that conversation, you're still going to have issues for a long time. Disabled people want to be heard, and we want to be recognised as a person. All disabled people should have the same spark in their eyes as everyone else. But disabled persons have learned helplessness in many situations. We've learned the value of compliance at the detriment of our dignity, for the risk of losing something because we've experienced not being heard. So what are disabled people in New Zealand saying? And at a very high level, recently, the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities examined New Zealand. And so what disabled people said in our own report to this committee was that the inquiry into quality of care and services for disabled people in 2008 highlighted systemic problems, and we still need to implement all those recommendations. The Putting People First report recommendations need to be implemented. There are a number of structures in place that maintain the status quo of poor and unsafe services to disabled people. The next slide, yeah. There are a large number of reports coming out saying it's an issue, but there's very little progress on real improvement. We're good at being aspirational, but we're not very good at the follow-through. The definition of abuse in the Domestic Violence Act and we need to work on that urgently. We have limited acknowledgement of historic abuse that took place over years in different institutions as well, state institutions. And I do recommend, if you haven't already, a book that was recently published, Robert Martin's story, the man with the learning disability. It's called Becoming a Person, and the author is John McRae. Definitely worth reading. Good Christmas reading. And the lack of data and monitoring means it's really difficult to progress work, and it's also really difficult for us to say this is a big issue, because there's so little research, so little data available for us to use as we advocate. So the UN committee, they said to the New Zealand government that we must work on strengthening and helping women with disabilities get education, employment, and to combat domestic violence. And it also says that organisations representing disabled women and girls must be involved in those programs. We must urgently address those relevant laws, and we must replace substituted decision-making, where someone else makes the decision, to supported decision-making processes where the person is helped to make their own decision. We also need to ensure that any criminal processes that take place are followed in the same way that they are for non-disabled people. And there's too many stories, even as recently as this year, where a disabled person goes to the police to report something and it doesn't get heard, so there's no follow-through. The committee also said that we needed to have a system in place to detect and respond quickly when abuse happens. And we need to ensure it covers all disabled people in all environments, so the domestic environment again, and also to implement anti-bullying programs within schools. So where to with all this? So the Disabled People's Organisations were fortunate this year to be working with the government in a close partnership model where we gave input on what should be in the government action plan over the next 4 years. So the vision, really important, is that all New Zealanders experience equal rights of citizenship. So it's not just about disabled people, it's actually about all New Zealanders. So if we get it right for disabled people, we get it right for everyone. And that feeling of citizenship is a powerful one. Of the 5 self-directed outcomes, one is safety and autonomy. I am safe in my home, community and work environment. I feel safe to speak up or complain, and I am heard. Those assisting me, professionals and others, have high awareness, and I do not experience abuse. And so the priorities in this area are to reduce barriers to disabled people making decisions to determine their own lives, and reduce the number of disabled children and adults who are victims of violence, abuse or neglect. I'd just like to take a side step here and talk about the Clothesline Project, which is very much a grassroots project led by Robin Hunt and Wendy Rex in Wellington. The website is disabilityclothesline.org.nz, and it's about educating society about violence and abuse, to show what they're doing, to honour and remember victims, and to help with the healing. It's a really cool activity, and I certainly recommend accessing them to provide workshops with the community. They bring out t-shirts of different colours which represent different types of abuse, and generally the person themselves will write on those t-shirts the message or their experience or their healing, and it's a really powerful way for people to share their stories, put it out there, but be heard by people who are skilled and knowledgeable on how to hear those stories. And it's an important part of the process. So what I would like to do now is just put out a series of questions to help our conversation as the day goes on. How do you view disabled people when we're talking about abuse? What framework are you operating in? A charity to help, to do the right thing, or that right faith that recognises the person, or is it the medical model of someone to be treated and fixed and put out the door? Are you aware of the environmental and attitudinal barriers that exist in your environment, both at the ground level with individual disabled people, but also at a higher systemic level with policies and processes? Do you talk to, for, at, around, or with disabled people? In your work, what role does the disabled person have? Or what role do disabled people have? Is it a leadership role? Are they involved at the beginning, through to ongoing monitoring? Are they part of defining the problem and creating the solution? Where is the power balance? Where is the control? What are you doing to ensure better data is gathered? What are you doing to ensure more research will happen with disabled researchers? There's plenty of disabled people out there who are capable of doing great research. How are you addressing the systemic issues? Who are you working with on addressing the? How will we and this issue become more visible? And I want to point out that, generally speaking, we say the profile of disabled people in society is very low. And therefore, disabled people in abuse issues is even lower. What will you do to ensure disabled voices are understood? Are we being treated as a special case or as equal citizens? Is our work using a mainstream focus or is it a special service, a special add-on? Is your service or your information accessible by all? Is it in easy read? Is it in sign language? Is it in large print? Is it accessible for blind people? Is it accessible in a way that when the person reads that they don't cringe and feel patronised? And what are you doing to address the barriers? Does your service or work recognise the disability experience? If they come to a mainstream service, do they have the option of working with a disabled person? Do you employ disabled people in your service? Do you provide services both to disabled people and to the general population? Do the police, court, judges, etc. have the opportunity to learn from disabled people? And one of the other recommendations from the committee in Geneva was that the, I can't say the word properly, judiciary. People need to access convention training and human rights training from a disability perspective. And how can you assist in getting abuse within the disability community on the national abuse agenda? How will you make sure you understand the issue through the disability lens if you're not disabled yourself? Are you aware of additional issues disabled women and children experience? How does your work facilitate the experience of citizenship? So looking ahead, the next two slides are very general and I repeat them everywhere I go because if we're serious about implementing the convention in New Zealand, there are some things we need to do. So one is 3 operational strategies. The responsibility moving forward lies with the government and disabled people. DPO, Disabled Persons Organisation. It's also about having a partnership with government, UN organisations, other professional civil society research institutes. And we need to promote articles that enhance the ability for disabled people and the organisation to speak and be involved in activities like this. And finally, turning to disabled people themselves, it's important for disabled people to wake up and be able to speak out and take the knocks that come with it. Disabled people also need the opportunity to learn about the convention and what it means for them. And we've run workshops for disabled people to deal with part of the early group, and where people arrive thinking they knew all about disability issues. But when you work through what the convention thinking is all about, they come away thinking there's hope. The convention is the tool that will allow us to advance. Rights holders must also educate other people working in the disability field. And everyone must work together to make sure that this becomes a right in legislation and in policy. And then finally, disabled people in the organisation must have a clear conscience to act as a supervisor. So we should be able to be part of the monitoring process and to be able to wave the flag and say, hey, it's not working here yet. So I hope that those questions help to frame our thinking and our discussions, and I really hope that this forum will have the opportunity to reconnect again. I think we have a lot of passionate people in the community doing projects here and there, but it would be really good to be able to align them together with a forward-thinking strategic plan or approach, and to reconnect after a year to ensure that all our work is following the same direction. So, thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. Next, we have Judge Peter Boshier, if he would like to come up and give his points of view.
Tēnā koutou katoa. He pai kua hoki mai ahau ki konei ki te mihi atu. Kia koutou kua tai mai nei ki te titiro, ki te whakarongo, ki te kōrero, e pa ana abuse of the disabled. Tēnā rā watu mō te koutou karanga mai ki te kōrero i te ata nei. Anai nei ka huri au ki te reo tuarua o Aotearoa. Thank you very much for your invitation for me to talk to you this morning. And for me personally, it's always a joy to return to my birthplace, which is Gisborne. So I greet all of you who have come here today to look, to listen, and to talk about abuse of the disabled. It was a bit of a close call this morning, and there were a few shivers up Leslyn's spine. Last evening I returned from Niue, which is one of the smallest countries in the world, about 1,500 people. And I was dealing with family violence in Niue last week, got in last evening, set off out to Wellington Airport in plenty of time this morning. And unsurprisingly, it was this morning that I really began to focus on what I would talk about today. And so engrossed was I in my task that I didn't hear the boarding call. They actually held the plane up while I ran onto the tarmac and went on board. So I had a close call. The remarks that I want to make to you now are not in writing, but I am recording what I'm saying in the event that anyone would like to see what I've talked about this morning later. For me, the staging of this conference today marks what has been a very long and increasingly fruitful journey, which has culminated in Michael Roguski's wonderful 71-page report, which came out on the 18th of June 2013. I really warmly congratulate Tairāwhiti Community Voice, all of you here who have promoted this project, and Michael for your enormous skill, sensitivity and knowledge of the subject matter. When I read through your report again this morning, I noted to me these important points. Firstly, a low level of societal awareness of the disability abuse issue. That's number one. Number two, a variety of silencing processes which operated for a variety of reasons. 3, a lack of appropriate monitoring. 4, poor management practice, particularly in residences and services. 5, inadequate reporting. 6, existing legislation was thought to be inadequate. And that point about existing legislation is particularly picked up by Dr. Roguski in the Executive Summary, Chapter 7. When he went further with that, it seems funny talking about you in the third person, Michael. I should talk about you in the first person. What you did was to analyse what you perceived to be the law in 3 areas. You thought that the definition of abuse was unclear. You felt that the reach of legislation, particularly Section 4 of the Domestic Violence Act, did not go far enough. You secondly said that the Crimes Act itself was not broad enough and that the evidentiary requirements were too high. And then thirdly, the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act, you said, was not explicit enough in what the requirements of a welfare guardian should be. So the purpose of today's conference, when I went back to the web and reminded myself of why we'd come together, given that this report is now over a year old, is to generate discussion and to look at Dr. Roguski's research recommendations and talk about where to from here. Not for the first time, Gisborne being a leader in the community. I wanted to highlight in particular, though, the fourth object of today's conference according to the background material, and I quote, "To bring about social change that protects disabled people from abuse and harm." And it's worth repeating that. To bring about social change that protects disabled people from abuse and harm. Now, I'd like to pose some questions today, knowing that it is but the start of a long journey. I want, though, to set a bit of a context. I was appointed a judge in 1988. It seems an awfully long time ago. The Domestic Violence Act came into force in 1995, and it radically changed the way we saw family violence. Before that time, there had been things called non-molestation orders, and the whole ambit of domestic violence was really utterly different. There was a terrible, terrible homicide in Palmerston North. And as a result of that, a commission of inquiry was undertaken, and it was seen that the children who were killed by their father, and he then killed himself, had in fact been stalking and committing family violence for years. The signs should have been evident for a long time that something terrible was about to happen. the then Chief Justice, Sir Ronald Davison, undertook a report, and he criticised law for being inadequate. The result was a very meaty Domestic Violence Act which changed the landscape. But the Domestic Violence Act hasn't been straightforward. Domestic violence itself is not that easy to report, police and enforce. It's not the same as some other crime done in full view of the public. In 2005, a family violence task force was established, which was quite unique. It included a number of chief executives of government departments, NGOs, and for the first time that I could recall, senior members of judiciary were invited to join this task force, and the Chief District Court Judge and I did so. In the very first report that came out dealing with family violence in New Zealand, we, the task force, were struck by the sheer awful nature of domestic violence in New Zealand. The task force went for some time and then in its latter stages was joined by membership from the disability sector. As a result of that joinder by the disability sector, a meeting occurred in the Chief Judge's chambers. The disability sector was concerned that it seemed that the task force wasn't giving enough attention to those with disabilities, and for that matter, elder abuse, and that the Domestic Violence Act wasn't being applied to protect the really vulnerable who needed it. The perceived problems in that meeting were threefold. How was it that a person with a disability could easily make a complaint? Second point, how could they report it? Thirdly, what was the evidence that a person in residential care or in another setting would need to come up with to establish to the requisite standard that a protection order was appropriate? It was a long but difficult meeting. It seemed to me that there were insuperable problems in two respects. One was in recognising and being sensitive to what people with disabilities wanted and needed, and that was ready protection. But the second was how, in fact, it would work if a protection order, for instance, was granted against a carer. Normally, a protection order stops contact between two people unless it's by consent. And when you think through the consequences of, say, someone in residential care obtaining a protection order against a worker working there, I wondered how it would in fact work in practice. I wondered how it might work in a number of settings, but could see it working in a family whānau setting at home where you could, for instance, more easily set boundaries. There were, to me, a whole lot of challenges in trying to make the Domestic Violence Act apply to protect people with disabilities who might have real trouble communicating, who mightn't know who to report abuse to, and when then a report was made, to whom and who would act on it, because normally complaints are made to the police. Well, rather sadly, the Family Violence Task Force pretty much ran out of steam. At the end of 2012, I left the position of Principal Family Court Judge and became a Law Commissioner. So what is the job of the New Zealand Law Commission, just to complete a wee bit of this context? Well, our prime job is to review the laws of New Zealand to see if they are adequate. That's a pretty big job. In fact, our references come from the Minister of Justice. We're not free to simply pick a book off a shelf and have a look at it. And so whether we undertake a project or not is prescribed by a process that's set by the Minister of Justice. In fact, we law commissioners have toyed from time to time with the whole area of the adequacy of elder care law, and it follows that we've from time to time wondered whether something of the sort that Dr. Rogowski's done is warranted by way of an overview. But at the moment there are priorities which centre on some other things. I thought I should say that today I want to speak to you not as a law commissioner, but as chair of the White Ribbon Committee. I am, of course, also a family court judge, and I'm bound to bring the experience of about 26 years on the bench to some of the comments I want to make. But the reason I became involved in White Ribbon is because it is about attitude change. Our speakers so far this morning have talked about the need for attitude change. I think that Michael's research is simply invaluable as an absolute starting point because it deals with issues that are largely hidden. There is so much which can be researched which is out there. Pick anything. Injuries on rugby fields which happen in front of anyone, road deaths, you name it. But abuse of disabled who are being cared for out of the public view is not known about apart from the sort of work that Dr. Rogowski has done. So does the abuse that he's referred to occur? I suggest that anecdotally all of us have probably encountered disability or elder abuse. Certainly, I think there are enough stories in the media that actually get out, particularly about the residential care of the elderly, that from time to time are startling reflections on abuse that has occurred. Probably it won't surprise you to know that of all of the areas that Dr. Rogowski has talked about, I most want to talk about the legislative framework. I agree with you, Michael, that the real answer to some of the issues that you have raised may be beyond what is currently available in law. Now, why is that? Well, can we first of all deal with the Domestic Violence Act? It undoubtedly has potential to help, particularly where there is a disabled person who is cared for within a family setting. That's because this whole act was promoted on the basis of putting a domestic relationship as being at the centre of whether you could get protection or not. So there are some settings where you can get protection, such as you're living with someone, but what if you're in a boarding house with 40 others? What if you're in residential care with 100 others? What if you're in a setting where the only relationship you have with others is the fact that you are sharing that accommodation? There is no relationship other than that. Is a person who cares for you, who is nothing more than a professional, in a domestic relationship with you? And it's very doubtful that the Act ever intended to extend that far. I've also centred this morning on the real problems that I see in reporting and enforcement. And I think for the vulnerable, this actually is one of the key issues. I don't want to deal too much with the Crimes Act. I want instead to get straight on to the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act. This Act came in 1988. It's been one of our best pieces of social legislation. But it too has its shortcomings. For some of you who have worked with this Act, it enables the court to appoint welfare guardians and property managers, and it empowers people while they are still capable to appoint by attorneyship who they want to manage their property and be their welfare guardian. The Act's good insofar as it sets up a framework, but it doesn't do much more than that. It's pretty much self-help. It doesn't, for instance, have an office which helps you find a welfare guardian. It doesn't teach you how to go about being a property manager. It sets up the law on how it can be done and who it applies to, but it's pretty much up to everyone to then go for it. So if you've got a neighbour or an elderly parent or a child that's been in an accident and damaged, it's pretty much up to you to make the running to get appointed as a welfare guardian. Someone will by and large not do it for you. I do agree with Dr. Roguski that the evidentiary requirements that you talk about, Michael, particularly in the Crimes Act, but I suspect generally evidentiary requirements are too high and not workable for this area of social justice. Now, I'm talking to you this morning at a time when just in the last couple of weeks, the Minister of Justice announced that she was re-referring back to the Law Commission work on alternative trial processes, particularly in relation to sexual violence cases. All of you, I hope, know about the Louise Nicholas case where police officers were tried for rape and in circumstances which were less than desirable, they were acquitted. When you saw the documentary of the Louise Nicholas case, some of us shuddered with embarrassment. I think it is felt that the law needs to change, be more user-friendly, and have its focus rather better than it has at the moment. So what might some of our solutions be? Two things to mention here. First of all, I think that the law is always a good basis for a framework. It's always important. Can I give you an example of one area where I think the law has led social thinking and social change, and it's the Smoke-Free Environment Act. I guess a lot of you were like me when we started off all those years ago. I absolutely remember as a young lawyer, clients would come in to my office and puff away, and I used to have those smelly things you could buy, usually for toilets, sitting in my room to try and get rid of the heavy smell of cigarette smoke. We remember the days on aeroplanes where those ridiculous signs said no smoking to the rear of this sign. The Smoke-Free Environment Act came in and said you're not allowed to smoke and cause people damage in public. And now I suggest we accept that as a reality. So law can change and can lead. There's another big thing about change, and that is attitude change. It's about what we actually want to do and why. I think it's in this respect that White Ribbon has got so much to offer. About a year ago, a group of young kids who probably now bitterly regret it, at least I hope they do, decided to call themselves the Roast Busters. And using social media, they skited about abusing alcohol-fed young women, particularly sexually. It showed an attitude in New Zealand which is there. I think even in the year that's gone by, there's been an attitude shift that this is deplorable. So I think with all things, including domestic violence, family abuse, and abuse of the vulnerable, disabled and elderly, we are at the start of a meaningful attitude awareness and shift. I wanted to think about other models which I liked that we could begin thinking about that might work for us. What do I work with that I quite like? And there are some examples. Some of you may know of the bad old days of mental health treatment in New Zealand. In 1992, the Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act was passed, and there are some really great parts to that act that I think we should put to one side and keep there in the kite. I think the Act did a great deal in talking about when interventions could occur and when they could not. It gave much better oversight of the treatment of the vulnerable than had been the case. The Act created district inspectors to undertake a monitoring role. Judges were given huge powers to inquire and make orders reversing mental health professionals' orders if justice required it. The Act set out in very, very unequivocal fashion what patient rights were. And finally, the way in which we judges go about our mental health hearings is inquisitorial. We do not do it in the adversarial way that I think Dr. Roguski is concerned about when it comes to protecting the vulnerable and the disabled. So as we're thinking this through, what am I saying? Do we need a whole new body or commission in New Zealand? Can we think of something that already exists under which we can place the umbrella of better protection of these human rights? Well, getting back to the objects of today's conference, we're to discuss and try and talk through the future on a framework. So what are the features of a framework that I see as emerging from the Tairawhiti research? I'm going to list these for you in what I hope is a clear fashion. First of all, there's got to be advocacy for the vulnerable, because vulnerable, such as people with disabilities, can sometimes advocate clearly and sometimes need a hand. Secondly, there needs to be monitoring. This is an area where things can happen without them being evident, and therefore monitoring is essential. Thirdly, I think there needs to be a cohesive management of the disability, elder abuse issues in New Zealand. Whatever we might decide here needs to feed into a national framework. Fourthly, I think there needs to be a clearly identified avenue for complaint and protection. I wondered whether we could feed this into the role that judges have, but you know, the judiciary is not too different from some other parts of our work. We are now very busy trying to cope with the raft of crime and family law work. And I wasn't sure whether, for instance, the family court was at all appropriate to give yet further work to when we're already bulging at the seams. Next. The form of protection needs to be real. It needs to be real. I think there's considerable doubt that the Crimes Act and the Domestic Violence Act are in fact suitable vehicles. I think in reality what we're talking about is the protection here of personal rights. People with disabilities have the personal rights to be looked after with dignity, with respect, and to be free from abuse. I'm really drawn to the idea of looking long and hard at the Protection of Personal Property Rights Act as being the best existing legislative vehicle I can think of to see whether it could be expanded to provide an overview of the sort that we're looking for. What, for instance, do you think of the idea of, instead of there being individual welfare guardians for those that want them, there is the position of official guardian for the disabled created? The role of that person in that person's office, if it were created under the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act, could be to initiate, to inquire, to require explanations, to seek meaningful interventions, to require assurances from those against whom there is complaint, and to use, amongst other tools, compulsory conciliation. I think the purpose of today is to discuss where we might go to from here, given the expert views that Michael has expressed and the fact that he considers that so apparent is the problem that the present framework is inadequate. Given that I have suggested to you that I think we will struggle to really make the Crimes Act and Domestic Violence Act spread to where we want it to be, should we be looking at the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act or some other vehicle with which to give people with disabilities a real voice, real advocacy, and real protection from harm from those that care for them but who abuse them in the process? So those are my thoughts. I wanted to put something there which might form the basis of ongoing discussion. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Judge Peter Boshier. We've got the next three presenters, we've slipped another one in there, actually coming in via webinar from Auckland. So there'll be a little bit of a slight delay while I actually activate that and get it set up. So if anyone does need a quick comfort stop, perhaps we can have maybe 3 minutes or 5 minutes of a break, just as I get that set up. So we're aware that obviously we've got a few more now until we have a break and some lunch at the end. So feel free to have a slight break and we'll be back very soon.
Kia ora everyone. With me today is Sam. And I'll just say a little bit about the photo there. Katie is co-project manager for Keeping Safe, Feeling Safe. And there you can see me and Sam sitting next to me, and Manu, who also is a Keeping Safe, Feeling Safe member advisor for the project. Member advisors are involved at every stage of the project. Just like to say thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the work of People First to stop the abuse of disabled adults. The two jolly policemen in the photo, and I don't know if they're joining the webinar today, are senior officers based at National Police Headquarters, and they are in the crime prevention team. We'll say a little bit more about the work with the police in a couple of minutes in our next slide. Just also like to acknowledge Think Differently campaign for funding our project and for all the help and support. They really are an awesome group of people. Keeping Safe, Feeling Safe comes from an initiative from the UK around stopping the abuse of adults with learning disability. We've been working on the project since 2008. Steering group to address the issues around the abuse of people with learning disability. We have made some progress, but as you know, there is so much to do. Some of the areas we really need to focus on are around prevention, reporting, and a multi-agency response about working together to stop the abuse of disabled adults. You'll see in this slide Kylie and Raymond. They're also member advisors, and some of you may recognise Raymond. Came down with me to Gisborne earlier in the year to run some workshops with Idea Services, and they're both sorry they couldn't join the webinar today. The next slide, please. Just a little bit about Keeping Safe, Feeling Safe. It's a project to help people with a learning disability to keep safe and to feel safe in the community, and to create across the police and social services positive behavioural and attitudinal changes towards people with learning disabilities when they report abuse. People need to feel safe and to be safe, to take part fully in their community and to live a full life and to be fully participating citizens. They also need to feel safe to be able to speak up about abuse. Keeping Safe, Feeling Safe also has a violence prevention programme, which is a set of workshops for adults with learning disabilities, the police and other services where we all work together. There's a set of resources that we've developed which aid communication with the police and other services, and a Train the Trainer course. We'll talk a little bit more around the workshops and the resources in a moment, but the Train the Trainer course has been developed thinking around long-term sustainability so that it's part of business as usual and not just a one-off program which we know doesn't affect positive behavioural and attitudinal change long-term. We worked in a collective impact way to stop the abuse of disabled people, a multi-agency safe working framework for adults at risk of abuse. It's the opportunity to work with other communities, older people, people with mental illness and all disabilities to develop ways to safeguard disabled people and others, developing policies and procedures around zero tolerance to abuse of disabled people. Next slide, please. I'm just going to pass over to Sam, who is going to read the aim of our project.
Okay. The aim of our project is to help adults with learning disabilities to keep safe and to feel safe, to work with people from the police, social services and other groups to help them to understand what a learning disability is and what things stop people with learning disabilities from keeping safe and feeling safe. We will work together to make policies and ways to stop bullying, harassment and abuse from happening in the first place, to take reports of bullying, harassment and abuse seriously, to make sure that everyone says no to abuse, the zero tolerance.
Thanks, Sam. So just picking up on those three, I just need to go back to that one slide. Picking up on those 3 points. The first one, the need around educating people with learning disability about their rights and what abuse is, which makes real the Disability Action Plan, Personal Safety Priority 6, A and B. And also around staff training and training for the police and people working in the violence prevention sector, so that they understand what learning disability is, what the issues are for people, the barriers around reporting, which I know Michael will have spoken about this morning, so that we can work together to develop the zero tolerance to abuse policies. In October this year, we held a hui sponsored by Auckland Council and working with Spectrum Care, amongst others, called Zero Tolerance to Abuse of Disabled People and Beyond. We asked people to come to the hui to think about their role and responsibilities in stopping abuse of disabled people. we asked attendees to think about a pledge that they might make towards this commitment. We had 38 organisations make pledges and a total of 77 pledges around how we can work together, ranging from some organisations wanting us to come and do training around what learning disability was, or wanting us to help them develop policies, or working, for instance, with the local district health board to set up a multi-agency group that safeguarded adults from abuse. Comments we had were well received, and stating that it was really great to see different people in the room bringing the violence prevention sector together with the disability sector. Thank you. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the workshops. At the workshops you can find out about what abuse is, your rights, the law, how to keep yourself safe and to make a complaint if something bad does happen, and how to talk to the police. Support services and the police attend the workshop, so we all learn together. Some of the barriers around talking to the police, for example, around giving a good description of an offender, around the perception of the police that a person with a learning disability cannot make a credible witness. We have resources developed that help the police to communicate when someone with a learning disability makes a report of abuse. An easy read reporting form, a keeping safe card where someone can write down their trusted adult on the card, and if they are feeling unsafe can use the card to help them to get some help. We are working with the police and others to look at setting up reporting centres in the community where people can make a report to someone who's been trained, and also safe places. What we've found is that people feel confident to report to a neighbour, someone at their church, a family member, and not so much to statutory organisations. So somebody at the local dairy, if they're feeling unsafe when they're out and about, can pop in, and if they need support to ring the police or their trusted adult, then that can happen. Sam's just going to say a little bit now around his experience around talking to the police.
I have autism. I don't get danger, so I cannot flee from danger. I don't understand body language and cannot read people's emotion or reactions. When we talk to the police, they need to realise that there are a lot of people who are in the autism spectrum or just have a way of being in the world that may have these characteristics. Our goal is for the police to take us seriously and to act for our rights, to make it all information accessible and in plain language, to have some training and understanding about people's reactions when they are dealing with the police, to be in partnership with the community to stop violence and abuse of people with learning disabilities and physical disabilities.
Thank you, Sam. So just to recap, at the workshops, participants, people with learning disability, are encouraged to practice and apply empowerment and self-advocacy, to learn together skills to build positive, healthy relationships with others, and to learn effective tools and strategies to keep themselves safe. Next slide, please. Just a few photos here taken over the last year. You may recognise a few faces there. We're working with key partners and feeding into the personal safety priorities of the Disability Action Plan and the key recommendations of the Putting People First report. Thank you. Next slide. So just to sum up, safeguarding adults at risk of abuse, the need for setting up a framework, developing policies and procedures, and working with other organisations and groups that are, if we use the term vulnerable adults, which we don't like to use, or at risk of abuse. And the differences between the case management currently around family violence and the need to look at a case management process under a safeguarding framework around poor practice, harm and abuse. our aims and our goals for 2015, well, one of them is to make sure that we follow up on those 77 pledges, so that will keep us busy, is to roll out the Keeping Safe, Feeling Safe project and programs across New Zealand via our People First coordinators and networks, and to develop a safeguarding framework. One piece of work will be starting with Auckland District Health Board around that multi-agency response, to do staff training and workshops and working locally with Domestic Violence and Disability Group, and to support the work of the Disability Action Plan and Putting People First report, and to work with the police to ensure that they record disability as one of their categories in recording abuse, as they do now around ethnicity, age and gender. And finally, to have the opportunity to work together with you for a more effective use of resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, everybody. It's very strange talking to a photograph of myself, but it's wonderful to be here. I've been doing research into why domestic violence and the disability sectors are not communicating better about the abuse of disabled people. And from this research, there are two things that I thought I'd talk to you about at the seminar today, two things that you can do something about. So I did 70 interviews with 90 people who are professionals working in the domestic or sexual violence sector, the disability sector, or in government services that are related to the abuse of people, not necessarily disabled people, and asked them questions about the way that they worked, why they worked the way that they worked, and how they understood the relationship between violence and disability. So the two things I'd like to talk to you about are the models that I identified that people worked from, thank you, and secondly then I'll talk about the practice that drops out of those different models. Now, those of you who work in the disability sector will be accustomed to using this language. I've used the disability language of medical model and social model, but it also sits, I believe, across both sectors. So if we're talking about the violence model, the medical model is looking at individuals and individual deficit. The social model is, in all sectors, looking at a socio-political understanding of where we're working. So when I looked across the answers from the disability sector, the domestic violence sector, the sexual violence sector and the government sector, what I thought the most important things were the similarities between people's understandings. So this comes from all of those different sectors, although they may be worded slightly differently. So in the medical individual deficit focus, whether we're talking about women who have been abused, women who have been raped, disabled people, as you all know, people can look at them from the tragedy model where it's a terrible tragedy and the victims there are people who are victims and we need to rescue those people from the tragedy that they've been in. The charity model where we're doing things for poor unfortunate people, naming people as victims, and the superheroes who rise above their circumstances. So that could be abused women who manage to leave abusive relationships and go on to do fantastic things, or disabled people who climb Mount Everest, or do those things that other people don't do. So we have these varieties of ways that we identify people, but we look at the individual person and we talk about the individual and their circumstances. And this basically comes from a deficit model. So we see the individual as having some problem. There's a problem that's cited in the person, and that requires something to change within the person, or we need to treat the thing that's wrong with that person. And we expect them, therefore, to conform to certain norms of how they are. And this actually enables people like in the police and the justice system and other places to talk about real victims and not real victims, because if people fall outside of those accepted norms, if they behave differently, then they're not actually seen as real victims often. So we expect people to conform to the needs of the system, to fit into the system and to behave in certain ways that fit with our stereotypic understanding and our understanding of individual deficit. alongside that is the idea that within that individual medical, individualised way of looking at people is that choices are very controlled and constrained. So the services that are available fit certain parameters. We were talking here before about how difficult it is for older women to get into refuge, that often older women who are abused are referred to age concern. Women with children, male children over a certain age, may not be able to get into certain refuges because they have older boys. We have constraints, and we understand those constraints, but there's constraints around the services that we have. And therefore, people are not fully able to use their own agency because they have to fit into certain boxes, certain structures to get help, which uses hegemonic thinking, paradigm thinking about who's valued and who's not valued and who's important. So often within services you'll have hierarchies of whose needs you meet. So it might be that you just meet the needs of people who are the 3% of the most mentally ill. So those hierarchies of need of who's valued and who's not valued within different systems. People who work in this way tend to work in a silo approach. They tend not to work across sectors because they're seeing people through the lens of one issue, and often helping within this is a power relationship. It's paternalism. It's helping others. It's helping those poor people who need our help from a paternalistic point of view. And some people in all of the sectors work from that individual deficit model. Other people work from a socio-political model. And that's about the basic tenet of this model is an inherent respect for all people, understanding what human rights means, and that human rights apply to everybody, the same human rights, to men, to women, to able, to disabled people. People who work from this model have a critique of power and privilege and oppression, and they question that paradigmatic hegemonic thinking. They question whether those privilege hierarchies are correct or not, and will challenge them. And also within this model, people understand that it's not about individual deficit, but it's about, as we know with the social model of disability, that it's the system that's disabling people. It's the system that's preventing people being safe. It's the system which is not enabling people to live the lives that they want to live, or that we would expect them to live if we had true human rights for everybody. So it's about enabling processes, empowering people to be in charge of their own destiny, about putting systems in place which enable those things to occur. So when we are looking for what's not working, we are looking at a whole system structural approach to those things. So those are the two models that I saw across government, across the disability and the violence sectors. And out of those falls best practice. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So you can see on one side there's general best practice. And this is that everybody is a person, and that when we're working with people, we are listening to people, to what people are really saying. We're doing what people want, not what we think is best. So we are working with people as equals, and we're respecting their knowledge and their experience and their pace and their understanding of their own circumstances, and recognizing that they are the expert in their own circumstances, while we have options and information that we can impart and that we can provide to people to help them make decisions. The basic values that people talked about here were honesty and integrity, and people believed that they were involved in a process of enabling people's voices and eliminating the barriers to people being safe and doing what they wanted to do. And part of this is an understanding of interdependence rather than independence or dependence. So interdependence is walking alongside people. So when somebody requires support in the home, when somebody's traumatized from violence, when somebody is in need of help, we understand that we walk alongside, that we support, that we do things with people so that they can achieve the things that they want to do. So it's not about us as professionals taking power away from people, but it's about us enabling processes through our support. We're not blaming, we're not victimising, we're not pathologizing people. We're recognising the circumstances that they're in and moving forward and taking the steps that helping people take the steps that they want to move out of circumstances which are abusive. So building power. A step up from that, sort of from best practice to really good practice, is being able to do sort of critical thinking about the issues that you're involved in. So understanding that abuse is not a simple issue to work with, that the abuse of disabled people is complicated by a whole range of things, including stigma and discrimination, the whole socio-political context that people are in. Can you go back to the last slide, please? Sorry. Thank you. The critical thinking. That people understand hegemonic privilege and structure, and that they're comfortable working at that level of complexity. So that requires having an analysis of different levels of power, of interpersonal power, of understanding the power that we bring as professionals and how we work with people, having an understanding of organisational power and how that can create empowerment or can create powerlessness and dependency, having an understanding of political power and how those things can create powerlessness or can enable people. And also understanding the history of the movements that we work with. The disability movement and the women's movement, the violence movement, the anti-violence movement have arisen out of human rights and social justice backgrounds. And so understanding where those things have come from is critical to understanding the way that we work with people and why we work with people, how the social model was developed. The social model didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of that social movement activism of disabled people. The women's movement came out of social activism of the women's movement. And so bringing those values into the work that we're doing now and understanding why they're there. So that's best practice, is working alongside people and having a good critical analysis of systems and working to change systems with this underpinning of social justice values. Thank you. Now we'll go to the poor practice slide. So this is the last thing that I want to talk to you about. So you can see that poor practice is not doing those things that we've been talking about. It's about rescuing. So it's about people who see those that they work with as other, as different from them, as not as capable of as they are. And so they're going in to rescue people. Rescuing creates dependency and it creates powerlessness. Being without critical analysis of the work that you're doing, so that you see things as individual situations and don't recognise the barriers that are created by power relationships, by political structures, by the way organisations are structured. Not understanding those things and working with people as though each interaction that you're with them, each incident of abuse is an individual thing and not part of a bigger structural thing. I think this is a very important one, is people who want people to say thank you. And this is about conditional support. This is about people who work with people because of their own needs rather than the needs of the people they're working with. So I would say that this individualising of people from the research that I've done is a consequence of lack of training, of people not understanding what the enabling and empowering role is when we're talking about support, seeing it in a medical model. And it's also about having no history of the social movements and the underlying values of social justice and human rights that sit under those movements. So that's about actually not having any real values base to the work that you're doing, which enables you to blame and victimise. So women who have been abused in particular, often victimised. She was too lippy, she should have been a better wife, she shouldn't have argued back. she was mad, she was drunk, she was whatever. And you'll know this with disability too, issues around, that poor caregiver, they were just pushed to the end of their tether and they couldn't help lashing out. So when we individualise situations, we put the blame on the person who's being abused rather than on the abuser, and looking at the structural inequalities and the interpersonal inequalities and powerlessness that's been caused by that situation. So there is no other slide, sorry, that's me talking to me. At DVD, the Domestic Violence and Disability Working Group, where there's a range of people from the disability sector and from the domestic and sexual violence sectors working voluntarily together to look at this issue in Auckland. And we work alongside People First in the work that they're doing. We've developed training programs which help the domestic violence sector and the disability sector understand the issue of this relationship between domestic violence and abuse. It introduces the social model, it introduces abuse of disabled people, and it begins to look at how we can address that. And we are working currently on some generic policies and referral processes that people can use. We are really, really happy to share what we've done. We don't want it to just be Auckland, it's just that we are Auckland based. And so you're welcome to get in touch with us at DVD, to get in touch with Sue or me, and we'll find ways to share this information with you. So thank you very much for having us at your seminar. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our information. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Debbie and Sue. What I'd like to do next is call Leslyn up to the front, and we're going to have a slight musical presentation. So it won't be a moment.
Is that I work to manage a range of projects that affect young people aged between 12 and 18 years. And I'm so excited that we have some young people in the room today. This morning, through the presentations, Michael talked to us about past experiences, lived experiences of people who generously shared their stories with us. Sue told us about disability, and she told us about the convention and the rights that exist to protect all people. And Peter's talked to us about some amazing ideas that will help shape our thinking about what we can be doing better. But what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the future. I want to talk about the amazing young people, our rangatahi, and their amazing talent, because they are the future. What we've got to present to you shortly is a video exhibition of some photography work from an extremely talented and beautiful young lady who's here in the room with us today. Her name is Noelle Ratapu. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch her photography exhibition. Some of you may already have seen Noelle's work because she was profiled on a Access TV documentary. And so without further ado, I'd like, if we have no technical issues, for us to enjoy Noelle's beautiful photography.
just pray. The life I have isn't what I'd seen. The sky's not blue and the field's not green. I'm gonna ask you to look away. My broken life will never stay. Try too hard and I always lag. Days are grey and the nights are black. For me, wait for me. Wait for me.
I'd also like to acknowledge some other fantastic young people in the room today. And they've been here to help us all enjoy the morning as much as we can. So could you please help me say thank you to our wonderful young people who have volunteered from the Social Sector Child Advisory Group to help us with the hospitality today. Shani, could you come up, please? And Natalia and Pex. And I'm sure you'll agree they've done a great job of keeping everyone. Thank you.
Here's as well. Next and last of our speakers before a panel session is Anaya. So if Anaya, if you'd like to come up and...
Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou, ki a tātou. E hui mai nei, e raro te kaupapa hira. E pāna ki a tātou nei whānau haua. Ara e roto i tēnei rohe whānui o te tai rāwhiti. Nō reira, kia ora mai tātou katoa. E mihi atu ki te atua kei runga rawa, nāna nei ngā mea katoa. Nāna i whakaputai nei te tangata, nāna no i tangoai. Nō reira e pā, tēnā koe, tēnā koe, tēnā koe. Ara, huri noa ki te mana whenua nei. Ki ngā iwi whānui o te tai rāwhiti, ara ko te aitanga māhaki, rongo whakaata, ngā i tā manuhiri, ngā te oni, ngā te konohi, te aitanga hauiti, hoki ko Ngāti Parau. Nō reira, ko koutou, te mana whenua nei, no ngā iwi whānui o te tai rāwhiti, ka mihi atu ki a koutou katoa. Huri noa hoki ki tō tātou nei kaumātua, ko Papa Bill. Tēnei ata, nāna i tukua te karakia, nāna hoki te mihi whakatau ki a tātou katoa. Nō reira, i te pāpā, i te kaumātua. Tēnā koe, tēnā koe, tēnā koe. Ki tōho rangatira hoki, tēnā kōrua. Ki a koutou, ngā kuia, ngā kaumātua, ngā mātua, ngā whaia, ngā tamariki mukupuna, pāna ki a tātou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. My name is Inia Iruera. My dad is Mac Iruera from Te Whānau Apunui, from a place called Raukokore, which is close to a place called Waiho Bay. Our marae is Wairuru. Our hapu is Te Whānau Amaru Haidamuri. On my mother's side, I hail from Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Raukawa ki te Tonga, Ngāti Takihiku ki Tainui, and Rangitane. A little bit about me. My role here today is I'm here on behalf of the Ministry of Health. I am the Senior Advisor Māori for Disability Support Services in the Ministry of Health. And so it's a great privilege to be amongst you today, all of you who have collaborated and come together around these issues about, from my way of thinking, how do we manaaki, look after, protect and nurture our taonga, our whānau, and our most vulnerable, our whānau with disabilities. Now my role is to do with particularly Māori whānau with disabilities, and so I guess I have some messages here today to bring around at a national level in the ministry, our mahi around kaupapa Māori in terms of disabilities, around our Māori Disability Action Plan, which is called Whātau Marama, and also just to convey to you some of the mahi we've been doing in relation to a report called Putting People First. So it's indeed a privilege to be amongst you. So I'm one of 6 children. There's 4 older than me, and there's 1 younger than me. And we grew up in Palmerston North. And when I think about our Māori leaders, in terms of following the mahi, there was a lot of East Coast Māori, there was a lot of tūhoi, there was a lot of our whānau who sort of migrated to places for mahi. And my dad was a freezing worker for 35 years at Longburn Freezing Works. And my mum was a social worker. Back in those days it was called DSW. Nowadays they turn the W upside down and call it MSD. She was a mātua whāngai worker. Now one of the principles of mātua whāngai was if you had a young mokopuna who was at risk, vulnerable, and had been impacted upon things like abuse and violence, then your first principle was to try and reconnect them with someone in their whakapapa. Not always an easy task, because sometimes that's where the abuse and neglect and violence was happening. So amongst that sort of context, I guess Māori are well aware around issues, sensitive issues like this. And so once again, I'd really like to applaud the Working Party, Tairāwhiti Community Voice. I'd like to thank you, Leslyn, for inviting myself and others here today, Trudell, Janet, and all of you from the Working Party to actually come together around these kaupapa. I rang a kaumātua this morning who's linked in with our mahi in Wellington. His name's Maka Tibble, and many of you will know him. And I said to Maka, tēnā koe te matua. Rongohia au tēnei kaupapa, which means I've heard about this kaupapa. You know, hea hato mahi pāna ki tēnei. You know, what's your connections to this mahi? And he said, well, I'm connected through the ADSAC, but I guess he hasn't been as well involved as could. So from where I'm sitting, I'm thinking, oh well, here's a kaumātua, here's a kaitiaki, especially around Māori disabilities, and I think a real resource. And so I'd like to invite you to nurture our kaumātua and our kuia into these conversations in a way that's appropriate, in a way that's culturally appropriate, and that this conversation goes very wide. Now, one of my perspectives, if you like, is that Māori within disabilities context are kind of like a marginal population within a marginal population. And so when we talk about the disabled voice, always, whether it's disabilities or whether it's whānau ora or this kaupapa or that kaupapa, I'm thinking, where is the Indigenous voice? Can I hear it, and what's it saying? And who is putting forward that voice? So I stand humbly before you, all of you, our our Ngāti Pākehā, our Tauiwi whanaunga, and our tangata whenua from Tairawhiti. And I thank you for this privilege and this opportunity to join on to your conversations and to encourage you to keep these conversations and grow them, and to grow your relationships and your connections around this kaupapa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So with that, can we go to our slides? I'm going to talk to you about Whaiataua Marama. Now, Whaiataua Marama was launched in August 2012 at a marae in Wainui o Mata in Wellington. And it came on the back of a lot of consultation, and also Minister Tariana Turia really giving it a good push in terms of she wanted to see some distinctive themes coming through for Māori and disabilities. And, you know, what do Māori with disabilities in their whānau want? What are the issues for them, for us, for our whānau? And so they came out with a fairly simplistic looking plan, but in looking at high level priorities, there's 4 of them. It doesn't mean it's easy to implement at all. And the first priority talks about improving outcomes for Māori disabled. And actually what it says is that, you know, we would like our providers to make sure that personal plans are culturally appropriate and they identify needs around cultural needs for our Māori users and consumers of services. Now, you might think that reads quite easily and quite simply, but actually it requires our service providers, it requires the ministry, it requires DHBs, it requires all of us to get around this and to support our providers to actually reflect our services in a way to Māori, in this case Māori, so that we get a better hononga, a better connection. Because that's a relationship, as you know, it's based on trust. And when we think about what do Māori consumers of disability services want, a lot of the time it's what all of us want. We want a service provider who treats us with respect, that they're reliable, that they listen to us, they understand our situation, and that we can build a relationship with. 1.2 talks about new support options. Now, some of you in the sector will know about the new model. And when I was talking with Minister Trudia earlier this year, and you will be aware that Minister Trudia is retired from her ministership, and we have a new Minister of Disabilities now for Health, and that's Sam Paseto Lotoinga, who's also Minister for Pacific Affairs and Corrections, and maybe some others. So when I was, I guess, talking with the Minister about the new model, the components of that is, if you don't know, we've done trials of LACs, which is similar to a navigator role, in East and West Bay of Plenty over the last few years, and that's finished now. And now we've tendered that out, and it's gone to a provider now called, I'm thinking, Imagine Better. Now that's into a, not sure, 2 or 3 year follow-up contract for East and West Bay of Plenty and the Lakes DHB region. Okay, so that's a navigator type role. So if you're familiar with whānau order navigators, similar, but this is about sitting alongside our disabled people and just sitting alongside them, and the journey begins, and then we look at things like what our whānau member with a disability would like to achieve, how they would like to be better connected into the community. An example might be joining a bowling club, swimming down at the local pool. How can we achieve some of these outcomes in a kind of informal way, actually, building relationships in the community? One example, when I spoke with some of the local area coordinators down in Whakatane, there was a case of a young person who had moved with his mum out to a rural area, and he just wanted to know some of the other children in his community. So they lived in, in a small a house next to a small farm next to them, and so she supported them to build some relationships with some of the families around them, and they had horses. And so it ended up that the local families around them, they came over and they got this boy, and he very much became just, a part of the local community in terms of the young children, and they'd go horse riding. So some of these outcomes might seem quite simple, but they mean a lot for some of our whānau. So in terms of the new supports, there's also choices in community living, which is, I guess, it's an arrangement where some of our disabled people don't want to. Our people with disabilities don't want to necessarily stay in the same residential type situations. If I'm a disabled person and I have 3 friends who have got disabilities and we all want to go flatting together, then why can't we? So how can we make this happen? So now that's been trialled in Waikato and Auckland. And so we're just looking at different types of supports, putting these out into the landscape for our people with disabilities to consider and perhaps take up. Now the other one is individualised funding, and that was really around being able to decide in terms of your own home help needs and personal cares. It was built around home and community support services first, and then from the 1st of November around respite care. You, as the consumer, be able to choose who you would like to provide that for you. There's certain criteria in terms of who can do what, but it's all about providing different types of supports. And the extension of that is called enhanced individualised funding, which goes even further. So there you go. There's some new supports. They are out there at the moment. They're not completely nationalised, all of them, but we're stepping through a process to open that up, alongside all of the other traditional support services that you'll be familiar with. So we'll go over to priority 2. So this is about supporting our whānau better. Now, I guess somewhere through the consultation processes, before the plan was signed off and launched, an issue came up around caregiver training to ensure that whānau have got access to culturally appropriate training to address the needs of our Māori disabled. So we're kind of working in this space around whānau carers' wellbeing resources. That's something that we're currently working on. And in terms of 2.2, developing the new model, well, I've sort of spoken a bit about that. The next steps around that is kind of nationalising these new support options while still funding our traditional support services. The Māori uptake is quite high in places like Northland, Taitokoro. For those of you familiar with Taitokoro, quite high Māori population like Tairāwhiti. And with individualised funding, you could choose one of your extended whānau members to come and do work around your house and provide some of your personal cares if you want to. So some of our whānau Māori in the north are finding that fits with their whānau context. It kind of just fits with the way they want to live their life, because the paradigm shift is now, many of you will know, it's more about self-directed living. It's about our whānau with disabilities want to see themselves on a trajectory of living their lives, not being passive or otherwise recipients of traditional support services. It's actually about they set the context. That very much fits with whānau order. Whānau order is about empowering our whānau. Skills, capabilities, but really that whānau have their own vision. They see themselves as, whether they're whānau Māori, everything they identify with, and looking at their connections and the way they want to live their lives. Some of the kōrero, and I'll get to it soon, we've just had a whole lot of hui with Māori whānau providers, Māori providers and non-Māori providers, around just how our consumers see themselves, how our Māori people see themselves. And many of them say, we're Māori first. That's what they're saying. He tangata Māori ahau. And then the disability thing kind of falls a little bit to the side, because the actual aspirational and more the side that's empowering for them is about how they want to express, you could say, their Māoriness. Okay, so we'll go on to priority 3. This one here is about relationships and partnerships with Māori. The first one is around the data that I guess, DSS, Disability Support Services, holds. And there's a system called Socrates, and the data comes in through all of the NASCs. And so this is the hard data that we know about, the numbers, and where all of our whānau with disabilities across Aotearoa, what services they're accessing or being allocated to, and the utilisation rates. So in terms of my portfolio around Māori, it's about analysing this data to see where our Māori people are geographically, what services they can access and what are available, doing some sort of data matching there, and then seeing what sort of needs or unmet needs and gaps exist as well. 3.2. This is about, again, relationships, community engagement processes with Māori. Hapu, iwi. Now this is a good one for all of our providers to consider. When I lead and facilitate these hui, I ask our providers, how many of you have relationships with mana whenua? What does that look like? Do you have a relationship with your local rūnanga, with your hapu, with your local marae? Do you have connections with your kaumātua kuia for this particular whenua, this wāhi, this rohe? Let's look at that. Let's build it. Next one. Priority 4, responsive disability services for Māori. So this very much gets into the heart of responsiveness for Māori. 4.1, we're talking about strengthening cultural competencies of our kaimahi in the sector and delivering cultural training. So some of you will know that there's an organisation called Te Pau, and they, on behalf of the Ministry and Disabilities, they administer 3 workforce development funds. One is around workforce development, another one around Māori leadership, and another one around consumer leadership. So that's how things are sitting at the moment, and there should be a Te Pau representative for Tairāwhiti or nearby. So that's currently what's existing, but the priority says in terms of 4.1 that we're trying to strengthen our workforce to be more responsive for Māori. 4.2. This one really talks about leadership pathways for our kaimahi Māori in the sector. Where are our kaimahi Māori in the sector? Are they in management roles? Are they in team leadership roles? Where are they? So maybe we've got some work in the ministry here in terms of doing some detailed research to be able to analyse that further. Do a bit of a stock take, find out where our people are in terms of money. One of the things we've got to be a bit careful about is if you have kaimahi Māori in your organisation and then you just defer to them for karakia and waiata and all this sort of thing, and then the next thing, okay, well, we'll take over now, thanks for the karakia. All right? Just those sorts of things that we need to bring into our awareness. Next slide, please. Okay, so in August and September, we held 5 hui. Now, some of you will appreciate to ensure that you get good representation, and I guess I wanted to hear from 3 key voices, was our Māori whānau with disabilities, Māori and their whānau, Māori providers, and mainstream providers in the sector. So I'd like to acknowledge a group called Te Pūringa. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Charlie Rahuri, Esther Tan, Janice Gardner, Donovan Clark, Tania Kingi from Te Pūringa. Te Pūringa are an amazing group. They've only really been established, I think it was 2001 or something, 2007. They're really a national collective of Māori providers who, have been funded to deliver disability services. And, they've positioned themselves to be a voice, a Māori voice for providers in kaimahi across Aotearoa. And they've got, I guess, particular focus around strengthening workforce and, just being that national collective voice in the sector. Now, in terms of our tikanga Māori, they absolutely uphold our tikanga Māori, and I must acknowledge them now because through our relationship with Te Pūringa, I asked them to coordinate coordinate and administer our hui, so that we got good reach and good connections with our Māori whānau, and particularly Māori providers and other providers. So we did. We held 5 hui, and I think we got 120 odd in Hamilton, 114 in Auckland. New Plymouth was probably about 50, Palmy was about 90 odd, and Dunedin was about another 50. All of that was, at least 410 participants, and that was a good thing because it had been a while since we connected with, with everyone really in the disability sector around Whātua Marama. And it was definitely something that Minister Trudia was really wanting to ensure that we maintain connections and focus around Māori with disabilities. It was around about really to do with engaging with our stakeholders and getting the conversation, getting the kōrero flowing around Whātua Marama, our Māori Disability Action Plan. Now this is where Maka Tibble and others on our Māori Disability Leadership and Advisory Group come in. We've got Sylvia Ratahi and Raina Baker from Whakatane, and they represent People First. But they're on this committee, if you like, as Māori with impairments. David Tamatea, who's from over in New Plymouth way. Donna Matahaere Aturiki, who's down in Te Waipanemu in the South Island there, sort of Dunedin and Christchurch. And Karen Poynton, who actually works at Te Whaotuaroa. So they're on our committee. And they're our group who really oversee the implementation of this Māori Disability Action Plan called Whātua Marama. We are grateful for their guidance and support. If we go to the next slide. These are the questions that we're asking people, and they're really, really big questions, actually. From the other slides, you might see that really they just echo the priorities, which is about improving outcomes for Māori disabled. Priority 2, supporting our whānau better. Priority 3, good partnerships with Māori. And priority 4 there, and the last one, building responsive disability services. So, you can imagine if you've got a room of 114 people and half of them are from mainstream providers, you've got maybe 20 Māori whānau there with disabilities and the others are Māori providers. You're trying to sort of manage that space in a way that you get some clear feedback. And we did. And I'm really grateful for that. And we're kind of working through that now in terms of distilling down the themes. So just the next slide, please. Next steps after that is that we're going to use this feedback in some way to put down some more detailed priority actions on the ground, focusing around Māori specific services and solutions, Māori consumer-led approaches and culturally responsive services. And if I go into some of those themes and just break them out a bit, the notion of by Māori for Māori, around Māori consumers, around whānau-led initiatives, and some of those approaches that are led out by Māori providers. Māori providers will see themselves as being most capable to deliver services for Māori. So in terms of the cultural responsive services, some of the questions that came up in conversations is, do our services reflect our communities, our whānau they serve? What is the quality of those services through their eyes in terms of Māori whānau with disabilities? And getting back down to, what do Māori with disabilities actually want? Now, some of that is around generic needs, which we're all familiar with. If you're talking about our whānau with disabilities, no matter whether Māori, Pākehā, whatever, and some of it is more culturally specific. There was also some feedback around Māori consumers auditing services. And I think I heard from one of the presentations earlier about who best to assess the quality of our services than those with the disabilities themselves. So that's something that's echoed there. There's this link to whānau ora about empowering whānau and sort of identifying their strengths and capabilities, and the whole thing around improving health, educational and economic outcomes for whānau. So some of the kōrero that came through was, how does what DSS, Disability Support Services, do in the way of funding services? And this kind of notion of the new model, individualised funding, enhanced individualised funding, local area coordinators, choices in community living, how does that fit with the whānau ora context? And again, those are really big questions. I don't necessarily have the answers either, but it's something that we need to continually think about. Another one of the key themes was around trilingual interpreters, and I know Minister Trudia was pretty hot on this topic. We had Stephen Tarns, who two Māori wahine who are trilingual interpreters, and apparently they're the only ones. We need more, essentially. So another really nice presentation from a man called Richard Petty, who is Turi, who's deaf, is around a culturally appropriate Te Reo Māori sign language, and himself and others have been involved in work around constructing an appropriate language. Because as I understand it, the international sign language or New Zealand sign language is based on the phonetic sounds of those Māori place names. So it could be Hikurangi, or it could be Porirua. It's not necessarily culturally appropriate to use the New Zealand sign to emulate the sound of those names from a tikanga Māori perspective. So that's the kind of work that's taking place, and I applaud it. I really support it. That's all I have to say about that. Look, I'll head over to the other second half of my presentation, and this is really about the Putting People First review, which many of you will know about. And just to let you know, I guess what's happening in DSS around this. This is a big report. It was very extensive, and many of you are very familiar with this. So the Putting People First Quality Review. So it was published in November 2013. I guess you can read that. At the heart of the project lies the essential recognition that for disabled people to be safe, the systems that safeguard their well-being must be designed with an attitude of putting people first. Quote, the review was undertaken by the late Beverley Grammer, David Russell and Karen Van Eden to learn from the past and improve the future. So it's quite systems focused, systemic related issues. We're quite strong in some of the recommendations coming through. It addressed issues around marginalisation of people with disabilities, and it was also about ensuring the systems and services ensure the well-being of people with disabilities. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, thanks. So the Putting People First Quality Review, it's been adopted by the Ministry of Health, by Disability Support Services, and there were 36 recommendations. So just to read my slide, the Putting People First Quality Review made 36 recommendations aimed at improving ministry processes and systems and strengthening provider performance. In line with the leadership role the ministry has in overseeing the safety and well-being of disabled people and setting the tone for the future, we have established 3 working parties or working groups to undertake over 60 activities associated with the 36 recommendations in the review. So essentially we've got 3 working parties working on different areas. We've clustered the themes together, and I'll talk about those next. So next slide, thanks. Okay, so the three headings, if you like, or the three focus areas for these groups. First one is called Supporting Providers to Place Disabled People at the Centre of Their Service. Second one around Giving Disabled People a Voice. And the third group around Improving Performance Management. Okay, next slide, thanks. Some of you will know Pam McNeil. She's our quality lead. We've got here for another 18 months. It's a 2-year contract. So we're really, really pleased that Pam's taken up that role, very much a leadership role. And I guess Pam's organising us and supporting us, guiding us, so that we can actually implement some of these recommendations. Okay, we've got 22 Ministry of Health staff and 3 disabled people. And Pam is vision impaired. She's the lead. Okay, all 3 working groups meet each month, as does a steering group, and oversees the work of the project. Right, so soon a visual representation showing all work areas and interdependencies will be available on our Ministry of Health website, and this will be updated every 3 months. Next slide, thanks. Recommendation 3, in putting people first, is about restructuring the roles of contract relationship managers around regional responsibilities. These managers are now based in the main centres, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, managing portfolios of community residential facilities for people with learning and or physical impairments. I'd like to acknowledge Bev Grammer, who passed away earlier this year, and the work that they did to contribute to all of our services in our sector. I guess they're part of a legacy, and we're part of this legacy, and the work must go forward, and so we carry that with much heart. Another group I'm aware of is Te Raupu Waiora, who are in Auckland. They're very much sort of governed and founded around whānau Māori with physical, sensory and intellectual disabilities. They've definitely got some perspectives and some advice that they can share, but they generally operate mostly around the Auckland region. And Te Piringa, who is the national Māori collective, if you like, in terms of Māori providers of disability services, just to help strengthen your conversation. This is definitely a tairāwhiti conversation, but it's one that we can all support from near and far. So just to bring it back to all of you, whānau, i ngā mātua, i ngā whaia, ngā kaumātua, ngā kuia, ngā tamariki mukpuna, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa.
Kia ora, thank you for that. We'll just have a short break just while we're going to set up a panel discussion. We've got some questions that have come in from the viewers that have been viewing this live. We got up to about 148 people viewing it live at one time. So there's been a lot of interest, and certainly that's very exciting to be in the room and be a part of this as well. So I'll shortly call for our speakers to come up. We'll have a panel arrangement here, and so then we'll have the panel, and then we'll have lunch after that. So if the speakers could make their way up here, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
We've started to get into models which are much more, shall I say, consistent with New Zealand values as they are now than they were 100 years ago when English law simply predominated. And there have been some really good cultural moves. So the answer to the question is this. I would hope that any good legal system provides good access to justice for dispute resolution. That's why I've tried to suggest in my remarks this morning that when, say, there is a person with a disability and someone feels they're not being treated humanely and with dignity, there is a quick, ready means to deal with what the issue is and its solution. Dragging something through the courts, in my experience, is a pretty torturous business. So that's a long answer to what I hope is the beginning of a much better journey for dispute resolution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. We have another question. Will the PPPR Act be amended to require police checks of all prospective welfare guardians and property managers? It's all aiming to you.
As soon as I've done 2 questions, I'm excused for... So what we require is for those who are candidates for either property managers or welfare guardians to fill out an affidavit in which they disclose, or they're meant to disclose, any issues such as mental unwellness, fraud convictions, bankruptcy, matters which might impact on their integrity. I don't know of any system which requires police checks on such people, and the reason is, without being unduly technical, this area of the law is what I'll call civil law, and the police generally don't become involved unless there is an avenue requiring them to. The question specifically is, will legislation be amended to require those checks? I don't know that that's on the table. If the meeting feels that that's something that you wish done, it should be on the table for discussion. As far as I know at the moment, it's not.
Great, thank you. This is, I guess, more of a point of view, but there is an immediate need, in my view, for solicitors appointed by the court on a fee-for-service basis to be skilled and qualified and to organise family mediation, to have read the whole file and to go wide in the family as in FGCs to seek the best response. Any comments, or we should just perhaps nod on that one?
Okay. Right. I don't think there's any doubt that when we appoint anyone in the court, they've got to be of the best skill set, both in terms of their knowledge and their cultural understanding. And it's not just a matter of tikanga Māori. For instance, in Auckland, there are many, many applicants of Indian origin, and to work out whether they're Muslim, Hindi, and what that translates into for good advice being given to the court and for advocacy matters a heck of a lot. So look, I've always maintained that when we make an appointment, if it's a welfare guardian, a property manager, someone who we're appointed to look after the interests of a subject person under the Act, that person's got to be able to communicate. They've got to know what they're doing. They've got to have the skill set. They've got to have humanity. And maybe because I'm a Gisborne boy, you've just got to have the reach of culture. And in the days of an overbearing approach based on a lack of knowledge of culture, those days have got to be gone.
Great stuff. A comment?
That you're here. I would just like to add that when we talk about culture, it's also important to include a perspective of disability culture as well. Often we miss the disability aspect in those conversations. I just want to put that on the table as well.
Great. Thank you for that, Rachel. Question for Michael. We get some specific questions now. What was the single most important issue identified by the research participants, and what do you recommend we do about it as a community?
I'd rather talk about the legislation. No, I think the most recurring theme was the lack of monitoring and supervision. and everyone said that that was their burning issue. What we can do about it, I think we've sort of covered that very well today, and I know that what's great is that Tairāwhiti, you've created this movement, and I've been privy to many discussions about what are we going to do in terms of monitoring, and I think it's that what we need is actually to pull all those interested parties together and to have something that can be like the bullet that goes further to make it actually happen. Is that an adequate response? Does it? Pardon? Yeah. So it's about lots of talking. We know it's a problem, so we've got to bring all these collectives together and to actually do it.
Fantastic, thank you. Question for Anaya. With an estimated 1/4 of New Zealand population living with some kind of impairment and an ageing population, is it critical for communities to have a plan in place to prevent abuse, neglect and harm? Does MOH have a strategy to support communities with their plans? I guess that was done early on in the day, before your presentation, perhaps.
Glad you saved the easy one for me. The Ministry's got many plans. The thing is, we're working across sectors as well. So, many of you are familiar that there's work happening around the vulnerable children space. There's sort of two ends that you're working at. Working at the spectrum in terms of prevention and promotion. We're also working in terms of specific interventions as well. Probably one thing I'm aware of is where you've got a kind of a dotted line between those who are aged with disabilities and then health of older people. So, yeah, the short answer is we've got plans, but it's not necessarily like there's one specific plan to cover everything that you've just represented there. In terms of my role, if I had to think about those Māori with disabilities, then you're talking across the full age spectrum as well. But in that context, it's a specific population around our Māori whānau, and those voices need to come through in the mix as well. So I guess it's an ever-evolving story.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you. And a question for Rachel. How can the Tairāwhiti community better support DPA to increase their membership and be an effective advocate for their members?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the best way to really set up educational programs for the community education in terms of our rights and our place in the world, developing our own identity, our own culture as a disabled person as well. And I think if Tairāwhiti Convoices can work with DPA Trudell, who's waving in the corner, to be able to provide programs and courses with more groups of community members, particularly if they're across disabilities, because we often find that people with one impairment don't always know what the issues are for another impairment. And so it's really important to ensure that we have conversations where different people are talking about their experiences and learning from it, but as well as that, recognising what we all share in common and using that common voice to really engage with our partners, many of you in the room, many of you within official organisations, but really I think it's all about embracing the whole person and embracing the culture and the identity that we have as disabled people, as well as all the other cultures and identities that we have, but also being able to project our place in the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. It looks like the last two, I'm just having an update here as well. Two more for Peter. Peter, how can the law be used to better protect vulnerable adults from harm or abuse? Should the law differentiate between vulnerable adults and the general public in the same way that the law protects children?
Do you know, I think if there's one thing that should be said about the law and why we really need the law, it is to give social justice to people who need it. So there are two categories of people. There are some who are not vulnerable, who do not need protection, and who should be able to access the law but probably pay for it. What drives me, though, is the other group of those that are vulnerable and who need protection. And I think coming from an area like this, you get very sensitive and alive to these issues. So what motivates me is the fact that those of us that have had the benefit of going through, in my case, Gisborne Boys High School, Victoria University, becoming a judge, is making sure that everyone has the right to social justice and access to the law. I think the reason, Leslyn, that I wanted to come today and be part of this was that I just can't think of any better purpose for the law than giving to those that are vulnerable rights that they simply won't get otherwise, because they don't have the means of forcing those rights themselves if they were under no disability at all. So for me, it's probably right up the very, very top of the mountain as far as the need and the purpose of the law is concerned. And that's where my energy goes.
Fantastic, thank you. And while you've got the microphone in your hand, does the White Ribbon campaign acknowledge disability-specific abuse, and is the campaign able to raise awareness of this issue?
That's a fair question, and I think a fair answer is that the White Ribbon campaign is starting to make this acknowledgement. If you look at the breadth of White Ribbon movement, publicity and momentum, you'll not see much concerning people with disabilities, and you will see a lot about the vulnerable who are female victims of family violence. But if you then go to that next step of those who, say, have other forms of vulnerability, such as disabilities, I think it's fair to say that we've got a bit of distance to go in developing that part of our work. We were having a discussion before about the fact that, you know, some aspects of domestic violence is very high profile. You get that dreadful stabbing in the North Shore a couple of weeks ago, and the television cameras are there, and all of a sudden it's front page high profile. One of the issues that I think we're trying to grapple with in this room today is that by the very nature of disability abuse, you're going to be struggling to make it as high profile as you might with some other areas of abuse. That's why we're here, and that's why I think the hui today is so important.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there anyone in the room that has a question or a comment? If you'd like to come up and use the microphone, or you can hand up, I guess, and I can.
I love being old because you can say what you like.
Well done, Nona.
Who am I going? I'm going to stand next to this gorgeous man. No, I don't want to sit. Because if I sit, my knees lock. All right. I do have two comments. The first one is I've been helping a dyslexic girl who loves the elderly, loves disability, but the way to get her certificate is written, and nobody will do an oral examination. And yet there are people out there that are perfect for the care because they understand the marginalisation of who they are, but we need oral examinations. Okay? And I have to say, being a member of DPA for many years, because I've been the disability, that DPA is there. We struggle for members, please. You know, for professional jealousies, for all sorts of things. Why are we doing this? DPA is out there as that voice, and we can work better together than just being CCS or Age Concern or anything like this. We are out there for disabilities. Please, let's get together and fight this blooming thing. And I just want to say, okay for the law, darling, but let's try and do something with attitudes around here. They are not good. Thank you.
Thank you, Nona. We have a comment from Wendy watching online, just vulnerable as a synonym for disabled people is not good or wise. She'd just like that passed on. So thank you for that, Wendy. Anyone else from...
Could you repeat that correction?
Okay, sorry. Vulnerable as a synonym, sorry, my accent, for disabled people is not good or wise.
Right.
And so she'd just like that well known. So thank you for that.
Can I respond?
Sure.
I can comment on that. The word vulnerable sort of makes that quite incapable and quite that we're not there, that we have to be looked after, we have to be cared for and so on. And while we use that sort of language, it's very hard for us to get ahead and actually be able to be who we are and be productive citizens. If you remember the awful case when Emma Agnew in Christchurch was murdered, in the media, the first response from media was because she was deaf, she was vulnerable. And it was really hard to get the message across that actually, yes, she was deaf, but she was also incredibly confident, incredibly articulate, incredibly capable and strong and independent and all the rest of it. But there was that automatic labelling that came out, and we see it again and again and again. And so this whole thing about social change requiring attitudinal change and so on, I think picking up on the point that you just made when you came out was just around, are we enabling the disabled community to take that step forward, or are we still putting those controls and restrictions in there that prevent us from doing that? And all the DPOs have minimal funding, if we have any, and we have such a big mission out there, and we want to work with all our partners to get there. But it's hard for you to do your work effectively without us, and it's hard for us to do our work effectively if we can't be there. So I think I really believe that the convention is a tool to help us step up, but we've really got to get that recognition, the value, our input, the value it adds to the work you're doing.
Fantastic, thank you. Any other comments from the room, or anyone wishing to make a question for the panellists?
Can I do it from here?
Sure.
Yeah. Kia ora, Inia. Inia, I hear all the kōrero around the service delivery in regards to tikanga, te ao Māori cultural component, whatever. In regards to the main city centres, how much of the research from that department is coming back home here? Because we live rurally, we're quite isolated, we're always left at, and it's lovely to have events like this, or we like this to come to, because we're not on the main trunk, and it's sad, I'm just quite sad that it just seems to be the statutory arena is now just staying focused on ministry main trunk lines, Auckland, Wellington, or Tautau. But, you know, they want statistics on Māori in regards to abuse. No mai hara mai, ki te tai rāwhiti, you know, because we're here. And yes, thank you to the team and Dr. Michael. And we had one night, and the brother Pete, you know. It's wonderful to be able to be present, but I would like that the Ministry of Health in regards to the cultural delivery go wider and take on board all the whānau hapua and iwi. It's a big process because, you know, Māori just kōrero, but the outcome is there, especially if we want to meet that part of the arm. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you for that. Any comments from the panel on that one? I saw everyone just nodding their heads, so it must be good stuff.
Tēnā koe e te whaia. I think in your kōrero you've really brought our attention to a number of issues. So I'll just respond to a couple. If I think about Māori health providers, and you know there are some here amongst your midst, I'd like to acknowledge Māori health providers who are funded around disability services. But how much of that information comes back? And I'd like to say through DHB as well, how much of that is actually acknowledged at that level and at the ministry level in terms of its contribution. So I was at a ministry hui a few days ago, last week, around the sustainability of Māori health providers, and this has come up for our attention. And I think what isn't acknowledged is the complexity. In terms of, if we're talking about, and I'll just keep the focus around Māori health providers, the type of service model in terms of our tikanga in action and what that looks like in terms of service delivery, the importance of relationships, the origins of Māori health providers, and that they see themselves differently as being another type of primary care provider, and to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of their strength has been around primary care and meeting a gap. And so I don't know if we've really collected those stories in any comprehensive form at a regional level to feed into a national story. And that's something I'm very interested in, because to me they represent the heart of the people, often in terms of governance structures, in terms of the support of kaumātua, kuia and local hapu around those areas. You're talking about kind of the why and the how they came on to the whenua and what they represent. And so if we think about kaupapa for Māori, often that's what we need as Māori to see as a kaupapa, something that we can connect with and identify with in terms of its intrinsic values that aligns with tikanga Māori. If you take something like Iron Māori, which I was participating in, I think last weekend, there was a huge undertaking, 1,500, and the vast majority of the participants in there were Māori. But when I looked at all of the whānau along the side who were clapping us on and cheering us on, in terms of, you're just trying to keep your legs moving after you come off the bike for 90 kilometres, that's what you feel is the tika te pono te aroha. And so these are the things that we need to keep telling those stories. It's not just kōrero whaia, this is the way that we record our history and keep it going, is to keep the kōrero going. We talk about our oral traditions, about how we hand down through our, that is our methodology. And it's for others to include that and to, I guess, to be appreciative of that and the value that that represents. So, yeah, you've touched on a lot of issues there. And so I think you're right. It's not that I think the ministry wants to just stick to the main trunk lines, but I think you're right. We need to hear some of the richness from our regions. I don't know if I've got a solution around how to make that happen, but that's, if we're talking about our whānau in terms of, some real innovation, some real beautiful mahi that's happening. Often it is happening out in our rural communities where you make $10 equal $100, and because it's the relationships. So maybe we need to be telling those stories. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you for that. Leslyn, perhaps if we leave it there, I think Leslyn's got a wee presentation perhaps to make. I need to hand over, of course, to our Kamatua for our closing comments.
Oh my goodness. But he'll do the real stuff. Because you'll have to walk behind. Sit on the uneasy chairs at the right. Okay, Bill will really close it. Do I have to have this awful thing? Okay, make it short, he said. But I want to say this. This has been an amazing project, and I want to say thank you. I have worked in this community for a hell of a long time, and at last I'm starting to hear about something that has not honestly been spoken about here at this level. This is amazing, so thank you all. But let's not go out of this room, any one of us, without changing attitudes to somebody, an organisation, a person, something. Because I have to say again, this is our problem, because we haven't honestly spoken out like this, I don't think ever, quite frankly. And I think it's up to us not to sit and say, poor us, nobody's listening, it's up to us, each one of us, to go out there and shout it out. Because attitudes will stop that abuse. Attitudes will stop the stuff that is happening in our area. And it's only attitudes. The law will help, but it's our attitudes that will do it. So thank you very much, and I have to say thank you to this wonderful tall poppies all along here, and they are all beautiful poppies, and it's lovely that we have you here in this area. As Roy Marta said, we often miss out, but thank you Leslyn and the team for bringing this very high profile research. Thank you Michael darling, great job, but to bringing this high profile team so that others around Highland, Step Highland, and others listening. There's a lot of people listening. Congratulations, Tairāwhiti, well done.
Great stuff. Thank you, Nona.
Koutou e maria mai nei o koutou mātauranga, o koutou mōhiotanga, ki te whāngai kia mata. Hea hoki, mata mātauranga, ka ki te kete o tēnā, o tēnā, o tēnā. He tāonga mōnga ki te haere ki waho, mahi nā mai. Thank you very much for bringing your knowledge and sharing it with us in the Tairāwhiti. Every bit of knowledge that you bring will benefit some of us, each one of us, in one way or another. It will help to fit our kete of knowledge and then enable us to go out there and do the mahi that we have to do. No reira, hea hake kore, kia koe I mea, whānau apanui, hoki mai rā ki te kai, hoki mai rā. No reira, kāre tongi ar tēnei mea te kore, te mea nui, anei rā. E ki nei koutou koe nei te hui nui, ai, he tīmata tonga noi o tēnei, I toku mohio. No reira, mahi anama, mahi anama. No reira, I tīmata tō tātou hui raro te koro wai aroha tō tātou atua, me ochi no I reira. Ko te inua I nea nei, ke tau namanaki tang katoa, o ta tātou kai āwhina I rungi a tātou. Te aroha tātua, me te whiwhinga tahi tangi, te wairua tapu. Mana koutou ārehi pai atu ki o koutou kāinga, ki o koutou whānau. Me reira, tēnā koutou, ki o roho ki te atua.
Kia ora, thank you for that. So, thank you folks for coming. As I said, we've got the working group this afternoon. So if you'd like to be a part of that discussion and see where the case study and the other projects can take us, then please hang around. But perhaps before we all leave or stop for lunch, is we just say thank you to our speakers. So thanks guys for coming along. So. Great stuff. Thank you to our interpreters as well. And our technology team. Well done, guys. Yes.